Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Toolbox project, where I'm going to be showing you how to mark out these mitred dovetails. Let's get going. Alright, so in the previous video we got the 4 sides of the box sized and squared up, ready to cut the joinery. And this stage is somewhat easy and somewhat difficult as well. The primary thing that makes it difficult is the fact that we need to account for a larger tail at the top for when we slice the lid off. If we make all the tails the same size at this point, by the time we remove it, that top one's going to be too small. And so if you're following the plans for this project, you're going to find it quite easy. If you're not following the plans, but you've got CAD software to design it yourself, then you're probably going to find this quite easy. If you don't have either of those, however, I'm going to show you the method of laying it out according to the material that you've sized and the amount of tails that you want on the toolbox as well. So let's do it. So here I've got a piece of plywood with one jointed edge, and we're going to assume that this is the bottom of the box. Essentially what we're going to do here is do a full-size drawing on this piece of plywood so we can use this as a template to mark the tails out later. So this is the bottom of the box. Firstly, we're going to square a big line up from the bottom. Next, on that line from the bottom, we're going to mark the height of the box. Let's say in this instance it's 250 millimeters, just to make this easier. After we've done that, we need to mark out the height of the miters at the top and bottom. So let's go 12 here and 12 up here as well. And next we need to account for the pins at either end as well. And no matter the size of your toolbox or how many tails you're doing, for this project I would recommend these to be about 6 millimeters. It's worth saying now that this technique relies on the pins being the same size as the material you intend to remove at the top of the box. And so in this case it's going to be 6 millimeters. I like 6 millimeters as the size of the pins for this toolbox, and it also gives me lots of wiggle room when I'm slicing off the lid afterwards. And so let's measure 6 millimeters up. So we've now got a miter and we've got a pin. This can go either side of the line because you're going to be using both sides depending on which side of the box you're marking. Then we need to measure the distance between these 2 inside points, which in this case has left me with 214 millimeters. But on this toolbox, I'm going to go for 5 tails. So we need to divide 214 by 5. I could work it out, but that's why calculators exist. So 42.8, let's mark that first, and then do plus 42.8, 85.6, and then I'll just keep pressing the equals button and that will add it on each time. Okay, so now I have got 5 boundaries that will indicate each of the tails. The problem being at the moment is that they're all equal sized. Remember, this top one needs to be 6 millimeters bigger in order to account for when I slice the lid off. So how do we do that? Well, what we're going to do is measure down 6 millimeters from each of these lines to give us the pins. However, at the top here, we've already done that, and so we can't measure down again, meaning that this one is going to be 6 millimeters bigger at the end. I'll show you now. So let's just spin this round and get a better view on it. So this is the top of the box here. This doesn't mean anything. This is out the boundaries of what we're looking at. And I'm just going to roughly draw on the tails just to make it easier to see. That miter is going to be straight, that's going to be an angle, that'll be an angle. These ratios are very off. So what does that give us? About, I haven't marked this very accurately, so it's about 37 in most instances, which means this one is about, 42, 43, something like that. And so by the time we slice through this with a 6 millimeter groove and that tail is then reduced, they're all going to be the same size. So if you're struggling to understand that, I would recommend doing it alongside the video so you can do it each step of the way. And also while I'm here, I understand there's probably going to be some sort of algebra method for working this out that will be annoyingly simple, but there's a reason I chose woodworking as a career and not mathematics. It's not really. But if you are interested in it and you are good at it, feel free to leave your formula in the comments below. It'll be interesting to see. So I've just finished redrawing mine to suit the dimensions of this box, and I've also put a face side and edge on here indicating that that's where the bottom of the box should go. So we've got the face side and edge on here to confirm that. We're then going to get the bottom of the box flush with the bottom of the plywood. And if you've drawn both sides of that line, you should see some little markings stick out that you can then scribe up the end grain. Of course, once you've done this side, you can then slide it up this way and you'll have markings on this side so you can do the opposite side of the box. And in this case, I'm doing the tails on the front and back of the box, but if you'd prefer them on the sides, then that's completely up to you. And then using those lines, we're going to start marking out the dovetails. You'll notice that we haven't got a marking gauge line on yet. This is because the method I'm going to employ in this project is by marking out the tails first and then only scribing in the areas I need to. It makes removing the marking lines easier at the end because there is no marking lines. And I'm also doing this in pen at the moment just to make it easier for you guys to see on camera, but I'd recommend you do this in pencil. So this marking on the end, this is going to be square across the top and also squared down the front. So just sort of guess where you think that marking gauge line is going to be. I'll do the other one now. And I only mark this on the front of the component. I don't bother doing it on the back because I can't see that when I'm cutting it out. And once you've squared that along the end grain and down the front, the rest is just dovetails. So you just make sure they're going the correct way. I'll do all the left sides to start with and then all the right. So I'll just quickly do this for the remaining 3 corners and then we'll get the marking gauge set up. Okay, and before scribing anything permanent in here, he says after marking out with a pen, I'm going to double check the size of not each tail, but just double check that the top one is the larger one on all 4 sides. But I'm all good. The larger tail is at the top of both components. So let's move on to the marking gauge. So if you've done dovetails before, you might be familiar with setting the marking gauge slightly over the thickness of the components you're scribing around. This leaves you with a joint that is protruding after assembly that you can then flush off the end grain. It's quite a good way of doing things. In the case of mitred dovetails, you can do that, but it gets a little bit weird with miters overhanging and paring them down. It's a bit of a weird one for this joint specifically. So what I would recommend you do is set your marking gauge to be bang on the thickness of the material you intend to scribe. Easiest way to do that is put the material on a flat surface and drop the stock down to rest on that flat surface. Obviously this is easier when you've got a wheel marking gauge such as this, and you've got to be careful that the screw on the end of the wheel marking gauge isn't protruding beyond the actual cutter. Side note, that's a good way of indicating the quality of these things, but drop it down so that cutter sits flush on the surface below and lock it in place. And obviously just double check this on the component before you scribe anything to be absolutely certain that that marking gauge is where you want it. And then with that setting, just scribe in the areas you need to scribe, at least for the show face anyway, because on the opposite face, the inside of the box, you can just scribe the entire thing. This is all going to be hidden within the joint, so make that nice and deep and pronounced. There we go, so that's everything marked out, and of course if you want more information on this stage, there is supporting resources below that will talk you through this process in more detail. Very important note before we move on, you could of course scribe around the pins at this point, but again we want to do it only in the areas where we want. However, at the moment we don't know where those areas actually are because we haven't cut the tails out. So what you need to do is keep the marking gauge locked in that position. Do not unlock it. Keep it where it is, and then when we are able to scribe around the tails onto the end grain of the pins and scribe down the front, we can then use that same setting to scratch only in the areas we want. Or of course, if you don't trust yourself, just scribe it all the way around now and deal with it later. So as always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do not forget to press the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next lesson.